They had it all, money and fame.
He was making $600 or $700 a year. She was a darling of the press.
And her murder made headlines.
They just blood all around the place.
She put up quite a struggle.
The vicious attack leaves a bloody trail, but where will it end?
He pursued her. He was surveilling her.
They're going to extremes to prevent anyone from knowing where they were.
We had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Sarasota, Florida, November 7th, 1997. It's a sunny autumn day in the wealthy seaside town that's home to many snowbirds and retirees. But at 4:20 that Friday afternoon, the city's 911 dispatch center receives a distressing call.
This is the 911 center. What's the matter? Mom. Oh my God. My mom is dead.
Okay, what makes you think that?
There's blood all around the place.
Okay, who else is in the house there?
I have my brothers and sisters.
How old are you?
I'm 13.
This is a teenage girl who's just gotten home from school, and she finds her mother on the kitchen floor, dead.
The daughter had come home from school, and the brothers and sister were wandering around crying, and she found her mother.
Is the person that did this to her still there?
Oh, I don't think so.
Okay. Calm down. We have help on the way.
I was dispatched as the primary unit to respond to the house. And it took me a few minutes to get there, but I ended up going in first.
Inside, police find 13-year-old Stevie Bellish in the kitchen.
She was standing over her mother, who was on the floor. Obvious blood, gunshot wound in the face. She'd been there for a little while. There's definitely no signs of life.
4 small children, bloody and distraught, but apparently unhurt, are also in the room.
First thing that we want to do is clear the residence. I had Stevie go outside and start bringing her siblings outside.
Once the children are outside, police clear the rest of the house.
I started going room to room, making sure that there was no other victims or any of the suspects. Looking under the beds, just looking for anybody that's there to do harm or other victims. Unfortunately, there was none.
The scene secured. Paramedics rush into the kitchen.
Scenes like this, it's pretty tough to forget. It is readily apparent that there was nothing that we were going to be able to do for her.
Stevie Bellish identifies the victim as her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellish. Sheila Lee Walsh was born in 1962 in Topeka, Kansas, to an Air Force pilot father and stay-at-home mom.
She lost her father when she was 10. He was shot down in a mission in Vietnam. Sheila's father was more than a role model to her. He was her hero, and she wanted to make him proud. She graduated high school in 1982 and started a job as a receptionist at a local law firm. And that's where she met her future husband, Alan Van Hout. It was kind of a whirlwind romance. He proposed to her on their 3rd date, and 3 months later they were married.
Alan soon became a successful businessman, the owner of a medical supply company in Bend, Oregon.
He had made a lot of money. I believe he was making $600 or $700 a year on that medical equipment business.
Now multi-millionaires, the couple relocated to Hawaii and then to San Antonio, Texas.
Alan actually told me, man, one of the most beautiful times he had was living in Hawaii for 2 years. He actually owned a yacht. He said Hawaii is very expensive, but he loved it. That's like the best place in the world to live.
Somewhere in that same time frame, he changed his name to Alan Blackthorne.
He was just like a playboy. He got money, I think he might have had a 911 Porsche.
In the mid-1980s, the Playboy became a family man. He and Sheila had 2 daughters, but the marriage didn't last.
Everything seemed like it was wonderful until kids come, a lot of stress come, a lot of different moves people make, they not going in the same direction. I mean, hey, that's why things get dissolved.
There had been a divorce. There had been litigation. There had been child support issues.
Sheila eventually received full custody of her 2 daughters. And in 1992, the single mom fell in love with a pharmaceutical salesman named Jamie Bellish. A year later, the couple married.
They really wanted the family. They had some difficulty getting pregnant, so they decided to try IVF treatment, and it ended up working a little too well.
In December 1995, Sheila gave birth to 3 sons and a daughter, and local media dubbed her the Quad Mom.
When she gave birth to the quads, it was a big media event here in San Antonio.
She was kind of a celebrity.
She was a darling of the press. It made a lot of news.
In 1997, the family of 8 relocated to Sarasota, Florida to start a new life.
He got a promotion in the Sarasota, Florida area, and they packed up and moved.
But for Sheila Bellish, it was the beginning of the end. On November 7th, just 6 weeks after leaving Texas, the 35-year-old mother of 6 is found dead in her home, surrounded by her 4 youngest children.
None of them appeared injured, but they did have some blood on them. There was blood on their feet, it was on their hands. Some of them, I recall, it was on the life vests that they were wearing.
We wondered why the children were in life jackets. It did look like they might have been out by the pool at some point, but we didn't know when or what time that might have occurred. It doesn't appear from the blood spatter that the children were close when this happened. It appears more like the children came to find their mother and were walking around her after she had passed.
Investigators want to know who could do something as horrible as killing a mother while her young children are in the house.
What's the motive? What is the possible motive for anyone to do what they did to her?
Coming up, police take a closer look at Sheila and Jamie's marriage.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle, which would be her current husband.
On November 7th, 1997, police find mother of 6, Sheila Bellish, murdered inside her Florida home. The brutality of the crime shocks even the most seasoned investigators.
This was clearly a homicide. She had her throat cut, had a bullet hole in her cheek.
She had some defensive wounds on her hands and arms.
She put up quite a struggle, and to me, that's a mother's instinct. She had those kids there with her, and she was thinking of her kids.
The trail of blood leading from the kitchen suggests the attack started elsewhere.
Despite severe and ultimately lethal wounds, she actually crawled down a hallway from a utility room.
From where the initial attack had taken place to where Sheila eventually passed away, it was approximately 17 feet.
There were blood splatter marks on the baseboard and somewhat up the wall every few feet. What was happening was she was crawling to get to the phone, and she was collapsing. She'd lost so much blood and was losing blood. She'd collapse every foot or so, and she'd smack on the floor, and it would throw blood up on the wall.
She had managed to get to the phone and get it off the receiver, off the hook, but she was never able to dial 911. It was an old rotary phone, so anybody who remembers the old rotary phones knows that dialing the 9 is the longest time it takes to dial. And I always did wonder if it had been a push-button phone, if she might have been able to at least get 911 pressed.
Investigators find no sign of forced entry, but the door between the utility room and the garage is open.
It's believed that that door had been unlocked.
In the utility room off the garage, evidence techs find a bloody knife on the floor.
It appeared to be a match to a set of knives that was located in the kitchen on a magnetic rack. The knife had approximately a 7-inch blade.
Investigators also find a .45 caliber shell casing and a bullet hole in the wall.
The shell casing was located in the utility room on top of the washer and dryer.
Since it appears to be where the shooting occurred, crime scene investigators pay special attention to the utility room when processing the house for clues.
We knew for a fact that the suspect had been in those areas. And we did develop a fingerprint on the side of the dryer. They all get submitted to the latent print division of the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office.
But the results will take time.
In 1997, we were doing most of our latent print comparison manually, which meant a human would sit there and do a one-to-one comparison. So it's impossible to just go through the fingerprint files and start doing comparisons like they do now.
Police are also canvassing the neighborhood looking for additional leads.
The neighborhood they lived in was a quiet neighborhood. Most people were retired. Back then, we probably had 5 or 6 homicides a year in Sarasota County. But it wasn't something that would happen in that neighborhood ever. So when it did happen, people were like, everybody talked about it.
Several witnesses did report having seen a man walk around in camouflage clothing and combat boots in the neighborhood, which they seemed to think was unusual.
Finally, investigators turn to Sheila's daughter Stevie, but the distraught teen has little to give them.
She was the first one to arrive home from school, and she saw her mother laying on the floor, and she made the 911 call.
After talking to a shaken Stevie, investigators turn their attention to the teen's stepfather, who they'll need to eliminate as a suspect.
Typically, when you have any kind of homicide, you always start with the inner circle and work your way outward. So we initially had to start with her current husband, which is Jamie Bellish. And we looked into where he was that day.
He was interviewed by some sheriff's deputies in Sarasota. He was absolutely heartbroken and devastated.
He told us where he was. He was a salesman for pharmaceuticals, so he had different places that he had been that day.
Jamie said he left the house around 7:30 a.m. He stopped and had breakfast, and then he went to Fort Myers to meet with some clients. He left there around 3 p.m., went to meet with a contractor who was working on the new house.
We were able to later, shortly thereafter, verify everywhere he was.
They quickly concluded he had no involvement in it.
However, when investigators ask who might have reason to hurt Sheila, Jamie Bellish suggests that her ex, Alan Blackthorne, might have something to do with Sheila's death.
They had a very rocky marriage. She filed for divorce. He very much resented it, and they fought constantly for at least 10 years.
Jamie says it got so bad that they decided to move away from Texas.
She wanted to get out of Texas because he was always taking her in and out of court, trying to get custody of the kids, and she had about enough of it. So she left Texas and didn't let him know where she was.
I think it was only Sheila's sister that knew where she was, and 1 or 2 very close friends who fully understood that they were not to tell anyone.
Coming up, did the family's disappearance push Alan Blackthorne over the edge?
He had lost, and it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
In Sarasota, Florida, police investigating the murder of Sheila Bellish have identified a possible suspect, her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
They had been fighting back and forth for, could be close to a decade, from the time of the divorce until 1997. And he would file motions for custody or to reduce child support, and She would file motions to restrict his ability to visit his children. She would file motions to increase child support. It went on and on and on and on.
In early 1997, Alan Blackthorne abruptly surrendered.
He shows up and tells his lawyer that he wants to abandon all rights to the children. He wants to surrender his parental rights. He signed essentially documents giving up any parental rights to his children. And that was a loss. That was a big loss.
While Sheila and Jamie were happy to finally have full legal custody, the fear that her ex had another plan up his sleeve still kept Sheila up at night.
Sheila was a nervous wreck.
And Alan being a very wealthy guy, and she was afraid of him.
He had lost. As we spoke with witnesses, it became clear that Mr. Blackthorne hated to lose.
Jamie and Sheila had quietly relocated the family to Florida.
Jamie was a pharmaceutical representative, and his company agreed to let him move his territory, and they saw an attorney to learn how to purchase that house without being a matter of public record. They're going almost to extremes to prevent anyone publicly from knowing where they were.
Despite their precautions, had Alan managed to locate his ex-wife?
Police contacted airlines and car rental companies to see if Blackthorne had been in the area recently, but they didn't come up with anything.
Placing him in Florida was a long shot at that point.
Sarasota investigators also reach out to authorities in Texas, who contact Blackthorne at his home in San Antonio on November 8, 1997.
He claims he had nothing to do with Sheila's murder, and he just found out about it on the news. Police said he didn't seem like he was trying to hide anything.
We found pretty soon that he was in Texas and couldn't have committed this crime.
But if Alan Blackthorne didn't kill Sheila, who did? Over the next 24 hours, investigators pieced together a series of clues.
They were canvassing the area, and they found an employee at a gas station who remembered a man coming in and asking for directions. The address that he was asking for was Mark Ridge, which is the neighborhood where Sheila lived. They also spoke with a neighbor who said they saw something strange around 9:15 a.m. on the day Sheila was killed.
There was a guy that happened to see a strange vehicle in the neighborhood.
The driver was a young man wearing camouflage.
This is a retirement community. Why would anybody be wearing camouflage outfit, combat boots in this neighborhood?
The witness doesn't know the stranger's identity, but he may be able to help investigators find the suspicious car.
He was able to actually give us a tag number, which was a huge break. And we did run that tag in Florida and got nothing, but we knew that they had just moved from Texas, and we ran that tag out of Texas, and it came back.
The vehicle is registered to a woman living in La Pryor, Texas, which is a small town just southwest of San Antonio. When police contacted the owner, she said her grandson was the person who primarily used the car, and his name was Jose Del Toro.
After a little digging, detectives learned that Del Toro is a small-time criminal from San Antonio.
He's in a work release program after a theft conviction, but he didn't show up that weekend.
We needed to talk to him. And in the meantime, Texas Rangers had located his vehicle and were sitting on it. We kind of thought there'd be a lot of valuable evidence in the car, but we needed some evidence to get a search warrant.
While Texas Rangers watched Del Toro's car, investigators in Sarasota contact local hotels, searching for evidence he'd been in the area.
They got a hit on the name at a hotel just a few miles away from the crime scene. Guest records show Del Toro stayed there on November 6th, the night before the murder.
He did use his own driver's license for ID.
Then, hoping to place Del Toro at the scene of the crime, investigators request a copy of his fingerprints from authorities in Texas.
The Sarasota County Sheriff's Office completed a one-to-one comparison of the prints from Jose Del Toro to the latent print that was lifted from the utility room, and they determined that it was a match to Jose Del Toro.
When we got that fingerprint hit, that was enough to get us a search warrant. And then when we did a search warrant on his car, we found the murder weapon. We found the receipt for the camouflage clothing that he bought right down the street from the crime scene. So we had a ton of evidence on him.
Coming up, investigators are convinced that they've found Sheila's killer. But they'll soon be wondering, was he acting alone?
When the conspiracy theory came out, then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
Investigators in Florida have identified a prime suspect for the murder of Sheila Bellish, a small-time criminal from San Antonio, Texas, named Jose Del Toro.
We had his fingerprints at the crime scene.
Searching Del Toro's car, investigators also found the murder weapon and a receipt for the camouflage clothing witnesses described.
His vehicle was parked outside of one of his girlfriend's house down in San Antonio.
The girlfriend said she didn't know anything about Sheila's murder. She said Del Toro told her he was headed to Miami to make a drug deal. But she said if Del Toro was involved, his cousin Sammy would know about it.
Del Toro is still on the run, but on November 12, 1997, Texas Rangers locate his cousin, Samuel Gonzalez, and bring him in for questioning.
Tell me what you know about this incident.
Supposedly just a beating and nothing about the killing was supposed to be occurred. And got to the point when I heard about that and saw the news and was kind of sad about it and disgusted about it.
Gonzalez tells investigators that his friend Danny Rocha had approached him a few months earlier with a job offer.
That's when the conspiracy theory came out, and then we knew we had a much bigger crime than what we thought.
He told us that he was asked to beat up Sheila, and he said, "I can't hit a woman."
Danny started talking about the money involved and said it could be as much as $10,000. And Sammy said he thought his cousin might be interested. His cousin was Joey Del Toro.
Those two traveled to the Bellish residence in Bernie, Texas. Timing was good for her. She got away.
They looked in the windows, and there was just a very little bit of furniture. And so they reported to Rocha that it looked like no one was living there.
Heard she had just moved out of state.
Gonzalez says Rocha had reached out to him again on November 5th with a new address for Sheila Bellish in Sarasota, Florida, and that he'd passed the information along to Del Toro.
Okay, so he's supposed to get down to Florida, hunt her, and that's it. All right, what happens next?
Sammy claims that Del Toro came back on November 8th and told him that he had fired a gun at Sheila.
He said he shot her, but he didn't know if he hit her or not, and so I didn't kind of want to hear about it. So.
He said that he shot at her, but didn't know if he hit her?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
you mention anything about cutting her?
No, he didn't.
According to Gonzalez, killing Sheila wasn't explicitly part of the plan, but that he wasn't surprised it happened.
Danny had asked Joey to beat her up in a way that she would not be able to take care of the kids. But he said that the best way to do it, just if you want to use 10 grand, is to kill her.
But when investigators ask Gonzalez if he knows where they can find Del Toro, he tells them that Sheila's killer has already fled to Mexico.
Joey is told by someone who had spoken to his grandmother that the police were looking for him, and he was wanted in connection with the murder of a woman in Sarasota. So he takes a bus to the border and walks across the border and you know he's gone.
With Del Toro on the run, investigators focus on the men who allegedly hired him, and the man they suspect is behind it all, Alan Blackthorne.
Why would Danny Rocha? Why would Sammy Gonzalez? Why would Del Toro put a hit on Sheila in Florida? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. But if Mr. Blackthorne comes into the picture, it makes all the sense in the world.
Talking to associates of both Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha, investigators soon established that there is a connection between the two men.
Alan Blackthorne and Danny Rocha's relationship, everybody knew about it. They were big-ass golf buddies.
Danny Rocha was a very good golfer, not PGA quality, but he was a very good amateur golfer. And he gambled.
He was a golf hustler, and he would play golf with Alan Blackthorne and make a lot of money because he usually would win.
The bets were sometimes $1,000 a hole.
But we needed to get Danny Rocha to get to Alan Blackthorne.
Investigators suspect that Blackthorne had also offered Rocha 10 times that amount to get rid of his ex-wife.
It all came back pointing towards Alan Blackthorne.
Sammy Gonzalez's statement gives the authorities enough evidence to take the golf hustler into custody for conspiracy to commit murder on November 17th.
The Texas Rangers actually went to his house and arrested him, brought him to jail in San Antonio, and then we extradited him back to Sarasota.
Getting him to talk isn't as easy.
I sat in on some of the debriefings of Sammy and Danny, which could be brutally difficult.
We didn't get much from him.
Rocha refuses to flip on Blackthorne, but will the investigation be stalled for long?
November 20th, investigators find out that Del Toro's been arrested in Monterrey, Mexico.
Then we had to try to get him back from Mexico. And that turned into a political circus because at the time, Mexico would not let you extradite anybody out of there if you had a death sentence on the table.
Coming up, with Mexico being a possible dead end, investigators try a different approach and hit a new roadblock.
So I said, "You're going to get life in prison." And he said, "I'll roll the dice."
By mid-December of 1997, 1 month after the brutal murder of Sheila Bellish, authorities believe they are close to unraveling the conspiracy that led to her death. Suspected triggerman Jose Del Toro is in a Mexican jail, awaiting extradition.
All the politicians had to get involved and try to work out those details.
Samuel Gonzalez has already agreed to a plea deal for his role in the plot.
Sammy was just a big teddy bear. I don't think he would even get in a fist fight. So I think he got used in the whole process, to be honest with you. But he did get the best deal because he cooperated.
Alleged middleman Danny Rocha has refused to cooperate. But on December 16th, prosecutors charge him with criminal solicitation to commit capital murder and pressure him to turn on Sheila's ex, Alan Blackthorne, the alleged mastermind behind the murder.
I went to the jail and I interviewed him several times because we really wanted Blackthorne.
Eventually, between the jail interviews and statements Rocha makes to the media, investigators piece together what happened.
Danny was looking for some money, and he had some ideas in his head about how he might be able to start a business or whatever with Mr. Blackthorne. And Mr. Blackthorne started talking about Sheila and started talking about how bad of a person she was, how bad of a parent she was, and verbalizing that he would like to see something happen to her. He'd like to see her beat up, and asking Danny about it.
Danny, in addition to making money, a lot of money, gambling on golf with Blackthorne, was a bookie. So apparently Alan thought that he had connections with unsavory underworld type people, but he really didn't. And so Danny asked Sam Gonzalez if he would get involved in having this ex-wife beaten up.
Before they could do it, Sheila and her family moved to Florida, which just made Alan even angrier.
Alan Blackthorne can't lose. No matter what he has to do, he's going to win. He had the mentality that he's rich, and he's not going to lose his kids to anybody.
He hires a private detective to track Sheila down.
When she moved to Florida, he pursued her there. He was surveilling her. He was following her.
As soon as the private detective located Sheila, Blackthorne had gone back to Danny Rocha.
Blackthorne told Rocha that there'll be $50,000 in it if I get my children back. And Danny says she'd have to be hurt pretty badly for you to get the children. And he said, that's fine. That conversation was repeated a couple of times. One time, Blackthorne said to him, look, the best way for them to do this is to kill her and dump her in the ocean or bury her in the woods.
One time, he made a statement. He wanted her thrown to the alligators.
With new marching orders from Blackthorne, Danny Rocha alerted Sammy Gonzalez, who contacted Jose Del Toro and set the whole plan in motion.
Del Toro drove basically straight through to Sarasota. He also, during that time, made dozens of phone calls on his cell phone.
He was a good-looking kid. He had a lot of girlfriends. He was on the phone with one or more of them throughout the trip. So that way we sent a subpoena to whatever cell phone company Del Toro was using for his cell phone. And using repeating towers, we were able to show the entire trip.
After Joey Del Toro butchered Sheila, Danny goes over to Blackthorne's house. And Danny says, yeah, they did it. I need some money to give to Del Toro, and I need $10,000. Blackthorne said, you guys fucked up. Because he had already heard that she had been found in her house. He knew before Rocha got there that Sheila had been killed. And she was found in the kitchen of her house. And he had instructed them to bury her in the woods or dump her in the ocean.
Despite being stiffed by Blackthorne, Rocha refuses to testify in court against his old golfing buddy.
The state of Florida, the Sarasota County District Attorney, was trying to coordinate with the Bexar County, Texas DA to work out a deal. They can't work it out. And his case went to trial.
So I said, you're going to get life in prison. And he said, I'll roll the dice.
When he goes on trial in January of 1999, the jury finds Danny Rocha guilty of first-degree murder. He's sentenced to life in prison.
Danny Rocha got exactly what he deserves. I think he'll die in prison.
However, Rocha's refusal to testify against him means that Alan Blackthorne remains free.
I think his wealth, maybe that gave him a sense of invincibility. He was out there after the murder and on like the evening news once in a while.
Blackthorne was so arrogant, it was irritating or aggravating. And he accused Jamie Bellish of being the cause, if not the actual murderer in the case. And frankly, it pissed us off.
Determined to get Blackthorne, investigators continue working the case. And in July of '99, make a major breakthrough.
Mexico agrees to extradite Del Toro and return him to Florida.
Coming up, with Del Toro's plea, only the alleged mastermind behind the murder remains at large. But will Alan Blackthorne ever face justice?
Sometimes if you got money, you can get away with substantial things.
In July of 1999, Florida authorities have finally apprehended the man who killed Sheila Bellish. 24-year-old Jose Del Toro.
He certainly wasn't a professional. He got into something way over his head.
After pleading guilty to Sheila's murder, Del Toro gives investigators a detailed confession.
What happened is that Jose Del Toro sat in the garage area for a bit until he felt comfortable enough to come into the house.
He was in the house for like an hour watching her, and he said he was getting ready to leave because he didn't want to do it, and she noticed him. When their eyes met, he panicked, and he said it was too late then. He had to go do what he had to do.
Del Toro's confession also implicates the man investigators believe is the mastermind behind Sheila's murder. Her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne.
He talked about how Blackthorne told him what a bad woman she was.
But even with Del Toro's confession, Blackthorne will be difficult to prosecute.
Texas has a code of criminal procedure. You cannot get a conviction based on an accomplice's testimony unless that is corroborated and links the defendant to the crime. And they tried every way they could to find that corroboration, but they were having trouble finding it. As time went on, it became more and more clear that they had a problem doing that, and that they might not ever get a conviction in state court, and that the proper venue for it would be federal court.
Prosecutors down in Texas, federal prosecutors, decided that there was a federal crime, planning a crime across state lines.
On January 4th, 2000, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Western Texas issues an arrest warrant for Alan Blackthorne.
Blackthorne was arrested in the parking lot of his country club.
We put him in the car, advised him of his rights, and then we took him down to the FBI office for being processed.
In June of 2000, Blackthorne finally stands trial for the murder of his ex-wife.
He was very cocky at the trial and was doing interviews with the press every day and thought it was a big joke. And he thought he was going to walk on this thing. But the two federal prosecutors were great. And they did their homework.
The circumstantial evidence in this case was very, very strong. Mr. Blackthorne was a very controlling man. He was a man that was very angry about this divorce. He was very angry about the custody of his children. He was obsessed about it.
She eventually prevailed, moved away. He couldn't control her anymore. And that was a good part of our proof, good meaning large part of our proof at the trial, to demonstrate why he would go to the trouble to have her killed.
Prosecutors also put the other members of the conspiracy on the stand, including Blackthorne's old golfing buddy Danny Rocha, who finally agrees to testify.
They were the witnesses that were going to make or break this case. If they were believed, we had a solid shot at obtaining a conviction and gaining justice. Their information had to be corroborated in state court, but it just had to be believed in federal court.
Will the jury believe them? On July 6th, 2000, they announced their decision.
The jury came back with guilty verdicts to both counts in the indictment.
It's taken almost 3 years, but the man most responsible for Sheila Bellish's death has finally been brought to justice.
But justice is an imperfect thing. Mr. Bellish will never get Sheila back. Sheila's gone forever. The kids had to live through this horrible nightmare.
But then you think about the emotional trauma of 4 children walking around their mother in the blood.
And then poor Stevie, 13 years old, came home from school and found her mother. It's heartbreaking. The damage and heartbreak that he caused all those people.
A tragedy like this is never forgotten. Jamie will never forget it, and the kids will, although they were quite young and won't remember it, they'll know of it, and they'll know what happened to their mother.
She was a great lady and a great mother. A lot of times, people that get murdered have a lot to do with why they got murdered. In this case, she did nothing. She was the most innocent victim you could find.